Charlie Munger was asked what his thoughts were on inflation going into the next couple of decades at his annual general meeting for the Daily Journal Corporation shareholders. And I'm very interested in analyzing his response, which is what I'm going to be doing in this video. So smash that like button and subscribe if you're new. You're watching More Money. Let's get it. What's up, guys? Longtime business news reporter Becky Quick was asking Charlie Munger at the annual general meeting for the Daily Journal Corporations what his thoughts were on inflation. And here's Becky Quick asking that question.
Do you think it's likely that we will experience a major increase in interest rates in the upcoming decades, like, for example, in the period between 1950 and 1980?
Now, Becky brought up a very interesting time period of inflation for the U.S. If you look over here, from 1950 to 1980, you can see that most years inflation was much higher than that 2% target rate that we typically target nowadays. Especially after 1965, you can see that inflation just continued to climb higher and higher. And it looks like just before 1980, it peaked at above 12%. And when you compare that with the historical inflation, of course you had that wartime inflation, but subsequent to that, you didn't really have a lot of inflation except for one or two peak years. And then you got into the whole post-1960s era where inflation was really high. And it wasn't until Federal Reserve Chairman by the name of Paul Volcker came in where that inflation rate was brought down. And so you can see subsequent to that, we haven't had high levels of inflation up until now where you see that large spike. Now, of course, any question on inflation would be very complicated to respond to. And so the way Charlie Munger addressed it is by starting very general in nature, and then he also went into a very big worry that he has. Here's Charlie on that.
Well, that, of course, is a very intelligent question and a very difficult question. When you throw money, when you print money on the scale that modern nations are printing it, Japan, the United States, Europe, etc., we're getting into new territory in terms of size.
And he's exactly right. We're getting into a quantitative easing level that we've never seen before and a size globally that we've never been at before. And so it's very difficult to tell what's going to happen economically. However, one way to look at it is by first looking at what has transpired with Japan. And that's how Charlie decides to discuss it, and which I think is the right approach here. Here's Charlie on that.
The Japanese bought back not only a lot of their own debt, but a lot of their common stocks. So the Federal Reserve System, you can't imagine how much money printing Japan has done. And they haven't had all that much inflation, and it's still a very admirable civilization. In fact, you could argue that Japan is one of the more admirable civilizations in the whole world. And in spite of all this very extreme government money printing they've done, and they haven't had terrible consequences. Now they've had 25 years of stasis with living standards not improving very much. I don't think that came from their macroeconomic policies. I think that came from the rise of tough competition for their export powerhouse from China and Korea. But at any rate, it's weird what's happening, and nobody knows for sure how it's going to work out.
So once again, he mentions that nobody really knows what's going to happen. But it's his next comment that's really telling. He hints that the Japanese experience is not exactly to be replicated in North America, mostly because we're not as culturally homogenous as the Japanese are. Here's Charlie explaining how the cultural differences between Japan and North America may be the difference in how we experience these impacts from quantitative easing.
I think it's encouraging that Japan can print as much money as it has and remain as civilized and calm and admirable as it has. And so I hope to God the United States has similar happy outcome. But I think the Japanese are better adapted for stasis than we are. I think it's a duty-filled, civilized bunch of people, a lot of them older, not many young people, and they just suck it in and cope. In our country, we have terrible tensions. It's way harder to run a country which is not monoethnic like Japan. There's some professor at Harvard that has written extensively on this subject. It's way harder to run a nation like the United States with different ethnicities and groups and so forth than it is to run Japan. Japan is basically sort of a monoethnic civilization which is proud of its ethnicity and of course, they can cope with the troubles better than some other people can.
So essentially he's saying that it might be harder in the West to deal with inflationary pressures because we are more divided culturally. And personally, I don't really want to believe that. I've told you guys on this channel already that when push comes to shove, we do come together as a nation and as people. We definitely saw that during the beginnings of the COVID lockdowns where we all just came together. We did what it took to get through it. And so I really believe, and here's where I might disagree with Charlie Munger, and I might just be wishful thinking here, but I do believe that I think that we can come together if this ever gets really bad. But Charlie Munger has a way to stir up a crowd. And so the crowd actually did start riling up a little bit here with more questions, I think. Becky Quick did try to jump in and ask another follow-up question there, but Charlie Munger cut her off and he put a sort of a bow on it that was a little bit of a happy ending. And you can see that here.
There's never been anything quite like what we're doing now. And we do know from what's happened in other nations, if you try and print too much money, it eventually causes terrible trouble. And we are closer to terrible trouble than we've been in the past, but it may still be a long way off. I certainly hope so.
So that's it on Charlie Munger's views on inflation. Now, guys, Charlie Munger is a big investor in Alibaba, and Alibaba is set to report on Thursday, February 24th. So that's next Thursday. And if you guys haven't seen the refresher that I did on this channel, you can get to that video right here. I cover all the most important points that you need to be aware of for the Alibaba reporting.